The story of HMS Speedy has always been part of my life. I grew up on a farm north of Brighton, and in that area, it's local lore. So with the publication of my third book, The Wreck of HMS Speedy, The Tragedy That Shook Upper Canada, my interest in the Speedy story has come full circle. But one might ask, why now? Why have I written this book at this time? Well, it comes down to this. Oops. All right. There. In the fall of 2018, I received a phone call from Kirsten Busklow of Belleville. Kirsten had been for more than 2 decades the associate companion of Ed Burt, the professional diver in Belleville who did the archaeological survey work in the early 90s looking for the remains of the Speedy. Sadly, Ed passed away in the fall of 2017. And a year later, Kirsten was looking to move on. She was also in a big hurry. "Will you be home this afternoon?" she said. And I said, "Yes." So a couple hours later, knock on the door, and this box ended up on my table. Kirsten said she'd been doing some housekeeping, and she thought Ed would want me to have this stuff. So I kind of stammered a little bit about how long it was going to take to get through it all. And she looked me in the eye and she said, "You keep it." And she left. So at that moment, I knew that my next book would be about the Speedy story. So why are we talking about the Speedy story at all? Well, it's part of Canadian history. Here is a rough sketch of Lake Ontario that will highlight the places that we'll mention during the story. There's the Farewell Trading Post on Lake Scugog, York, of course, later Toronto, Fort George here at the mouth of the Niagara River, Oak Orchard Creek on the US shore, Smith's Creek, which would later be Port Hope, Dean's Creek right nearby, and of course the town of Newcastle on Presqu'ile Point. And let's not forget Kingston over here at the east end of the lake, Naval Base, Army Base, Point Frederick shipyards. Really, Kingston acted as the supply depot for all the activity that was happening to the west in the lake. The fur trading post had been set up on Lake Scugog back in 1802 by Jacob and Lawrence Herkimer. They were a pair of brothers that worked as agents for the Northwest Company in Montreal. And in 1804, another set of brothers, William and Moody Farewell, were managing the post. They would make trips into the North Country to collect furs, bring them back to the post. While they were away, they left John Sharp, an ex-British soldier, in charge of the post. His job was to guard the place and to trade with the Mississauga people when they came around with furs. In May of 1804, the Farewell brothers returned from one such trip and found John Sharp murdered. Well, they buried the body of their associate best they could, and the next morning they paddled south across Lake Scugog, landed in near present-day Caesarea, and then started walking down the Scugog carrying place. It was an ancient trail that the Indigenous people had used for generations to travel between the interior and Lake Ontario. Once they got down to the lake near present-day Oshawa, they listened as Elizur Lockwood, a settler in that area, described how he had overheard a Mississauga man bragging to his buddies about how he had bashed in the head of a white trader. This man's name was Agatonakut, and he was very proud of what he'd done. In his mind, he had gained restitution for his family for the death of his brother, Whistling Duck, that had been killed by a white settler a year before. So in the Mississauga camp, at least, there was no mystery about the death of John Sharp. The Mississauga people had established themselves in their traditional summer camp there at the mouth of Annis Creek, later Oshawa Creek, and their chief, Wabakishiko, was very concerned at this turn of events. He was fearful for the safety of his people. So he made the very difficult choice of deciding that Agatonakut would be handed over to the authorities. The next morning, he led his people to the lake and they launched their canoes and paddled towards York. The very next morning, Moody Farewell and Elizur Lockwood launched a canoe, paddled down the lake, also heading for York. Their intent was to report the murder of John Sharp to the authorities at York. Well, this map of York Harbor in 1802 shows the environment they approached. Of course, there was the long sand spit that went all the way out here to the west to what we know as Toronto Islands today. Ashbridges Bay was a large marshy area crossed with channels and big areas of grass called wild hay on this map. There was a portage at the east end, but Moody and Elizur would have continued on to the second portage, which crossed directly into York Harbor, and they could paddle directly north to the town of York. In the meantime, Wabakishiko had established his people on their traditional camp in this area at Gibraltar Point, and they waited for the authorities to come and arrest Ogatonicut. Well, the town of York had been organized on a grid system around King Street. The largest building at this time was Parliament House here at the southeast corner near the shoreline. The western boundary at this time was Yonge Street. Well, there were about 450 people in York at this time, and very often visitors called it Muddy Little York. This was because the streets were often a muddy morass, but also because it was a little bit pretentious in spite of its small size in relation to established places like Montreal and Quebec, and even Kingston. And Moody Farewell and Elizur Lockwood went right to Parliament House, and they reported the murder of John Sharp. Now, there were two gentlemen there that would be very interested in this, Chief Justice Henry Alcock and Lieutenant Governor Peter Hunter. Well, the news created a lot of anxiety for these folks. The first order of business, of course, was to have Ogatonicut arrested. So a squad of soldiers was ordered from the garrison. They came down to Parliament House in a bateau, picked up Moody Farewell and Elizur Lockwood, along with the High Constable of Home District, took them over to Gibraltar Point. Moody Farewell and Elizur Lockwood were able to identify Ogatonicut as the suspect. Chief Wabakishiko handed him over to the High Constable, with the Mississauga people looking on. And you can imagine they would be angry and sad, but they did not resist. So the prisoner was brought back to York. Ogatonicut was incarcerated in the Home District Jail, which you see here. This was on the south side of King Street, just a little west of, well, St. James Cathedral today. And while the prisoner was being established in jail, the folks at Parliament House kind of considered their dilemma. They worried that a murder trial at York would inevitably mean the hanging of a Mississauga man there at the Home District Jail, with all of his friends and family camped over there at Gibraltar Point. There had been many alarms in the previous years, suggesting that the Indigenous people of Upper Canada were ready to rise up and massacre all the whites. You know, British settlers still had held an exaggerated view of Indigenous people as being violent and volatile, even though there'd been very little violence of this type in previous years. It was just conventional wisdom based on racial prejudice. Well, on a strategic level, the folks at Parliament House needed to maintain a very delicate balance. On the one hand, they needed to encourage more settlers to come into Upper Canada in order to build up the number of strong young men that could carry muskets and provide opposition to that next American attack that everybody knew was coming. They just didn't know when. At the same time, they knew that they would need the assistance of their Indigenous allies in this fight with the Americans. As a result, boats were loaded at Kingston with all sorts of goods, food and clothing and cooking utensils and hunting equipment, sent across Lake Ontario and distributed to the Indigenous villages to the north of Lake Ontario and Lake Erie, all to maintain good relations with their Indigenous allies. Sorry, meant to turn that off. Excuse me. So for those who were in power there at York, a small incident, a local event like the murder of John Sharp would not be allowed to interfere with this broader strategy that was going on. This amazing document found in the Archives of Ontario shows us what was in the mind of Chief Justice Henry Alcock at this time. I like to call it a note to self. It was clearly dated 31st May, 1804. Now, the first sentence says, went to the governor about the wait for London. Now, this has nothing to do with Ogatonicut. This indicates that Alcock was dissatisfied with his situation in York, and he wanted to use his contacts in London to gain a better position. And he was bugging the government to clear the way so he could sail to England at the earliest possible moment. The next line says, the Indian taken. Now, this says in the vernacular of the time that Ogatonicut had already been arrested on May 31st. And this is the only document that indicates a date in relation to these events that I've seen. Next sentence is the survey of the place where the murder committed. This means that even as of May 31st, they were considering the issue of let's not have this murder trial at York. And Alcock was looking at a law that said a murder trial must take place in the courthouse, in the county town, in the district where the murder took place. Now, it's a simple law, easily applied in most cases. But in this case, there was a problem. 2 years before, Home District, which used to stretch from west of York all the way to the Trent River, had been divided up, and Newcastle District had been established to the east. And the border was right there from about present-day Oshawa across Lake Scugog. Now, by 1804, only the first couple of concessions had been surveyed by this time, so for the new settlers coming in. So they could not, in a technical and legal sense, determine where exactly the Farewell Trading Post was, which district it was in. And this was critical because they did not want to have the murder trial at York, the county town of Home District. They much preferred that it take place way down the lake here at Presqu'ile, the little town of Newcastle, which was the county town of Newcastle District. Well, the last sentence in the note to self says that it would do if the survey made in the last of July. Now, they weren't able to make this time frame, but it's really fascinating to see a document in his own handwriting to show us what Chief Justice Alcock was thinking soon after Ogatonicut had been arrested. Well, the survey was conducted by John Stegman, who was one of the most experienced deputy surveyors in Upper Canada at this time. His report was very clear. It said the exact and positive situation of the House of Moody Farewell is 7 miles eastward of the division line between the townships of Whitby and Darlington. That was the border between Home and Newcastle District. Well, the Chief Justice would be happy with this result. It meant that, in fact, the trial of Ogatonicut would be held at Newcastle and not at York. So mission accomplished. At the end of September, the only ship anchored in York Harbor was the HMS Speedy. Its captain, Lieutenant Thomas Paxton, was given orders to prepare the ship for 20 passengers and their baggage to sail to Newcastle. Well, Captain Paxton was appalled at his orders. This was in October. It was outside the safe sailing season, and his ship was in very bad shape after a very terrible summer of storms. So how could he be responsible for so many souls on board under these conditions? Well, he refused to sail. Well, Lieutenant Governor Hunter was not amused. He simply threatened Paxton with court-martial if he refused an order. Sail to Newcastle or go to jail. That was your choice. Well, I'm sure that Captain Paxton had his wife and children in Kingston in mind when he relented and agreed to sail, but he would not be happy about it. Well, the Speedy was about 6 years old at this time. That was very close to its expected lifespan. A whole set of repairs and refits were on the books already for both the Speedy and its sister ship, the Swift, once they got back to Kingston after the end of the season. Ships built by the Provincial Marine at that time were constructed of green, uncured pine timber, which meant that they rotted very quickly, and every winter they needed major refits just to keep them operating the next sailing season. On October 5th, the Speedy sailed down York Harbor to the east and anchored about 200 yards off Parliament House, across from the landing place. Now, this was a gravelly beach that was right there near a break in the bank at the foot of Frederick Street. It was very convenient for the folks that would be getting on the Speedy in a couple of days, because most of them lived in the town of York. It also would be convenient for Ogotonticut and the soldiers. Here's the jail over here, Home District Jail, because it would be a fairly short march, Ogotonticut surrounded by soldiers, down to the landing place and on to Bateau and across to the ship. Then, 2 days later, in the morning of Sunday, October 7th, passengers began to gather at the landing place and began to ferry over to the ship. The highest ranking person to board the Speedy that day was Robert Isaac de Grey. He was Solicitor General of Upper Canada. The single man, about 32 years old, and he would be accompanied by his personal servant, Simon Baker. Now, Simon was a member of a slave family that had belonged to the Greys since before the War of Independence. In fact, Robert Grey wrote a will before he sailed on the Speedy, in which he stipulated that all of his slaves would be freed in the event of his death. Grey would also be accompanied by a legal assistant, John Anderson, who was a law student at York, and also his cousin. Other folks on the Speedy that day were Judge Thomas Cochrane. Now, at 27, he was very young to be a judge on the Court of King's Bench for Upper Canada, but he would be the presiding judge at the trial of Ogotonticut. John Fisk was the High Constable of Home District, and he would be responsible for the security and condition of the prisoner. James Ruggles was a magistrate and justice of the peace, and he would travel in support of John Fisk. Angus MacDonnell was a lawyer, and he would act as counsel for the defense in the trial. John Stegman, the surveyor, expected to testify at the trial. He was on the Speedy, as well as George Cowan, an interpreter and an agent for the Indian Department. The passenger list was rounded out by Jacob Herkimer, a merchant and trader, and he would expect to testify at the trial as part owner of the Farewell Trading Post. And of course, Lieutenant Thomas Paxton, captain of the Speedy, would have been barking out orders to several members of the crew. There were also a couple of soldiers on board to guard Ogotonticut. About 20 people in all were on the Speedy that day. There is a report that the Speedy ran aground before it got out of York Harbor. Now, there was no damage, and Captain Paxton was able to disembark in a couple of hours. However, this delay would have significant consequences. It usually took, a little over 24 hours to sail from York to Newcastle. But now with this delay, the Speedy wouldn't arrive at Newcastle until late in the afternoon into the evening in darkness. Well, Captain Paxton may have grumbled at his misfortune, but he continued. He ordered the ship to be taken out into the lake, and they were followed by a light westerly breeze. He took the ship out about a mile from shore, which was common practice in those days. They sailed through the night, and the weather held pretty well. Beautiful sunrise in the morning the next day. Then, during the morning of Monday the 8th, the wind picked up, and the clouds filled the sky. By afternoon, a strong storm was pushing Speedy towards Newcastle. And by late in the afternoon, the rain started to come down, and the passengers huddled under blankets and furs as best they could. We can expect Captain Paxton was starting to worry. At the same time, Moody Farewell and Elizur Lockwood were paddling their canoe towards Newcastle. They expected to testify at the trial of Ogotonticut. So late on the 8th, they passed Smith's Creek, which later would be the Ganaraska River there at Port Hope, looking for a good place to pitch camp. They went a little farther on and stopped at the mouth of Dean's Creek. Now, there is an account of the Speedy's story that says that when they were setting up camp at the mouth of Dean's Creek, Moody Farewell looked out into the lake and actually saw the Speedy for a brief moment. Today, Dean's Creek is Gage's Creek, and it goes under number 2 highway there just to the east of Port Hope. Then, so the evening of Monday, October 8th, HMS Speedy was getting closer to Newcastle, pushed by a growing westerly storm. Then, sometime later in the evening, a nor'easter hit the area. Now, this is a common type of storm in the fall, coming out of northern Quebec and blasting down across the Great Lakes in a northeast to southwest direction. This was a vicious storm that lasted for 2 days. It brought high winds and low temperatures. The Speedy was not seen again. After the storm was over, the folks at Newcastle spent several days scouring the shoreline in all directions, trying to find any sign of the Speedy. Not so much as a stick of wood or a piece of clothing was found. Nothing. On October 15th, a letter was sent from Kingston to York, and it said, "The Speedy's non-arrival prevents my sending the pay list for Ryerson to sign." This was 8 days after the Speedy sailed. Now, this is a mundane and practical matter, but it does indicate that the folks in Kingston were concerned that the Speedy had not arrived as expected. Then, on the 19th, Lieutenant Colonel John Vincent, who was the commander here at Fort George at the mouth of the Niagara River, wrote a letter to York reporting that he had been told of items from a ship washing up on the shoreline about 40 miles east of Fort George at a place called Oak Orchard Creek. Then on the 25th, a second confirming letter arrived at York to leave no doubt, and it contained the final evidence. The name of Paxton was on the lantern of the binnacle. This confirmed what many feared. In fact, HMS Speedy had been destroyed by that vicious storm of the 8th, and there was no hope for the 20 souls on board. This, in fact, was the only report of any physical remains of the Speedy being found. Let's fast forward to the modern era. This is Mr. Ed Burt. Ed grew up in Belleville, loved diving from an early age. He gained an engineering degree at Carleton University in Ottawa, and he formed 2 different enterprises. One was a metal foundry that specialized in marine products, and the other was an underwater exploration and salvage company called Ocean Scan Systems. Now, the jobs that Ocean Scan Systems would undertake were varied, but they included things like finding a small aircraft that had crashed in a northern Ontario lake, or, on occasion, the nasty work of pulling bodies out of submerged automobiles. They often worked with the law enforcement agencies, the OPP, RCMP, and Coast Guard. They even trained OPP divers. Well, there was a lot of demand for this kind of expertise. In the summer of 1989, Ed Burt was training OPP divers southeast of Presqu'ile Point. They were working over the shallowest point in a large underwater plateau called Dobbs Bank. A diver comes up to the boat and hands Ed a coin that he had found on the ground under the water. Now, Ed immediately identified this coin as his old vintage, and you can see that the date 1732 is very obvious. And further research would say that this was a piece of 8. Needless to say, Ed was intrigued by this find. Only a few weeks later, Ed and his crew were again out on Dobbs Bank. This time they were testing a new model of an ROV underwater camera. They would run the camera in the water, would take pictures of the ground, and the images would be sent up to a computer on the boat, and it would be stored on a VHS tape. That night, Ed took the tape home and reviewed it just out of curiosity. Well, he was amazed at what he saw. And the more he looked, the more amazed he was. He was sure that in this video, he was seeing items on the ground that looked to him like they were from a very old shipwreck. Now, the video is low resolution, and the visibility in the water was poor, but he thought he was seeing enough to warrant investigation. This image is the first screen of a promotional video that Ed created, which included that tape from the 1989 testing. A copy of that VHS tape was included in the box that landed on my desk in 2018. And that material has since been digitized for easier handling. Well, in order to get started, Ed contacted a professional marine archaeologist he knew, showed him the video. The archaeologist was interested. Yes, there's enough here to warrant further investigation. So the archaeologist set up an archaeological survey license and some funding. Ed created the HMS Speedy Foundation, a nonprofit corporation, to promote Speedy Project and to do some fundraising. Well, initially, bad weather kept them off the lake, so they didn't get out on the lake until June 16th. Then they began to follow the grid system that had been set out by the archaeologists. Now, that video from 1989 did not include any location information, and this was a very large area. So it would be a matter of eliminating one grid square after another until they found what they were looking for. This picture was taken July 26. It shows Glen Rover, the boat that they used for survey work in 1990. There's Ed Burt sitting on Avon, the inflatable raft that they used as a diving platform. The chief diver on Ed Burt's crew was Terry Coons, seen here with a scorching sunburn. Terry Coons was a very experienced diver. He gained much of his training from the U.S. Navy. I spoke to Terry at length about his role with Ed's crew and the activities of the Speedy Project. He said that in that first summer, through July into August, there were several weeks of beautiful weather. So they were out on the lake day after day. He said he lost 50 pounds from constant diving. They would run the camera in the water and the pictures would come up on the monitor. They saw something on the monitor that looked interesting. They'd stop the boat. Terry Coons would take the 35 millimeter camera down and take pictures. You could do that a dozen times a day in good weather. So it was hard work. Well, through the diving season of 1990, they continued doing the survey work, but they failed to locate any of the items that Ed saw in the 1989 video. Then, at the end of the season, middle of October, they hit the mother lode. They moved to the next grid square, and very quickly, they saw many items scattered around. So the last 2 days of the season were spent simply documenting all the things that they were finding. Well, it was great elation after a summer of seemingly unproductive work. Later on, Ed would grumble that they'd actually been on the adjoining grid square back in July, and they just didn't realize how close they were, you know, such as the vagaries of underwater exploration. Here's an important point. The archaeological survey license that was taken out for 1990 was applied for and given to a professional marine archaeologist. And as a result, the pertinent phrase in that license said, the licensee agrees to retrieve only a limited number of artifacts sufficient to establishing full and proper identification of the wreck. Well, this made sense, but of course, they hadn't found any artifacts until very late in the season and then only had time to document it. So even though this was in effect, they had no opportunity to use it. Then, in the spring of 1991, the professional marine archaeologist decided not to return to the Speedy Project. He said he just hadn't seen enough to indicate that this was actually the Speedy they were working on. Now, he identified the finds at the end of the season. He said that means you should continue. And if they found something that would more clearly identify the wreck as the Speedy, he'd be glad to return. But in the meantime, he had many other projects that were pressing that needed his attention. As a result, the survey license for 1991 was applied for and given to Ed Burt, who was not a professional marine archaeologist. And the pertinent phrase in that license said, retrieval of artifacts from underwater sites is not covered under this license. Well, in effect, even though they'd even found some things the previous year, they could not now in 1991 bring them up to try to identify the wreck. In fact, later licenses would begin to use terms like do not disturb, which means just hands off everything. Well, this situation was very annoying for Ed Burt. Now that they'd actually found artifacts, they could not legally bring them up to try to identify the wreck. And if they weren't able to begin to try to identify the wreck, then the marine archaeologists were less likely to be interested in joining the project. And if the professionals were not involved in the project, then it had less legitimacy, and they weren't likely to find if it was the Speedy or not. It was a classic catch-22 situation. So what did they find? They found a debris field. No, it's not a sunken ship, like we see in National Geographic and recreational diving magazines. It's a large debris field over a couple of square miles, many items scattered widely, often in clusters. Many pieces of wood are broken and jagged. This image created some interest in the archaeological community at the time. Here we see a pair of spectacles, a clay pipe, a cannonball, and a glass bottle. These items all are underneath the ledge of a limestone shelf. Now, Terry Coons told me he saw this site several times. He took pictures of it. He said that there was a succession of these limestone shelves starting at the shallowest point of Dobbs Bank in the north and every few hundred yards south as the water got deeper. And he said you needed to look underneath these shelves because items could accumulate over time from wave action. So you made a point of looking. And in this case, they saw 4 altogether. This image actually was passed around and generated some interest in the archaeological community in the first year or so of the project. Some of the most identifiable items were the masts. Speedy, of course, was a twin-mast schooner. Now, the divers first thought these were just logs, but when they looked closer, they saw, well, they were very close together. They are identical, and they were obviously manufactured. You can see the tapering at one end, and this was common. This was the end that went in the deck. So the dimensions and materials of these masts match perfectly with the documentation we have from the Archives of Ontario for British gunboats that were built at Point Frederick shipyards in Kingston there in the late 1790s. And another interesting point is that there is information in the historical records that gives us the resting place of every ship that was on Lake Ontario in 1804. It's not very many, half a dozen, except for the Speedy. The Speedy is the only ship that isn't accounted for in the historical records. Speedy was a gunboat, so there would be cannonballs and cannon. On the left here is one of several of the cannonballs that were identified in the debris field. And on the right is a foggy picture that shows a small cannon called a carronade, would be typical of cannon that would be installed on a small gunboat like the Speedy. Terry Coons was very interested in this round raised area, which he thought probably was a crest and might contain identifying information. Do not disturb. He was not allowed to scrape the moss off the crest. Ed often talked about the ship's bell. This is the best picture we have of the ship's bell from the 1989 video. Terry Coons stood over this several times, took pictures. He said it was so evidently a ship's bell, and he was excited that it might be from the Speedy. He said it was covered very thickly with moss. He stood over it and said it would just be a quick job of taking my knife out and scraping the moss off the bell to see if the name HMS Speedy is on the very common practice in those days. The name of the ship would be on the ship's bell. But do not disturb was in force. And Terry Coons knew that it could jeopardize the status of the project. So it didn't happen. Of all the items he saw during his work on the Speedy project, this is the one that he remembers most even today. Another big question remains after all the survey work was done, and that is what happened to all these 35 millimeter pictures? Terry Coons, as the chief diver, says he took hundreds of them during his dives. And none of them ended up in the box that I had on my table in 2018. I asked Terry Coons where they might be, and he said, well, Ed had them, and nobody knows where they are. So there's a mystery to solve. Well, after 3 seasons of survey work, at the end of the 1992 diving season, funding ran out, and Ed Burt had to get back to paying work. In fact, the Speedy project had been a money pit. Well, for the next number of years, Ed undertook a persistent promotional campaign trying to raise awareness in the community. And he focused also on corporate and government organizations that might be interested in funding some more survey work on the Speedy site. He used the HMS Speedy Foundation to raise awareness in the community, did speaking engagements and newspaper articles, even did things like T-shirts and this crest you see here. Ed also developed the idea that a marine museum should be built in his opinion, on Presqu'ile Point to house all these items that should be brought up from the Speedy site. Unfortunately, nobody was interested in a marine museum. And certainly the rules and regulations in the ministry would prevent anything like that from happening. But Ed kept on persisting and promoting this idea. Ed continually applied for survey licenses for the Speedy site, even long after 1992, when there's no survey work being done. It was no secret that Ed Burt hated doing reports to the ministry. And it was no surprise once I looked at the documents, but that by 2004 or 5, he was way behind in his annual reporting. And the ministry finally put their foot down and said, you will get no new licenses unless you at least try to make an attempt to bring your reporting into compliance. So in order to get new licenses, Ed was compelled to produce the project report for 1997. Again, it's 2005, no survey work since 1992. In his own contrarian way, Ed would use this opportunity to provide a full-throated version of what he believed had happened to the Speedy. He'd been leading up to this for a long time, and it all came cascading out in the 1997 project report, 120 pages, some with intimate detail about different forces and circumstances that he felt might impact what the route was that the Speedy took and how it met its end. Used all the pictures he had and charts and maps to support his ideas. It was really quite a production. The most important page of the 1997 project report was this nautical chart which showed the estimated route of the Speedy in the dark blue line. Now, as Ed told the story, the Speedy was sailing from the west, couldn't make the turn into Presqu'ile Bay, was blown off into Wellers Bay to the east. There were no sand spits across Wellers Bay at that time. Now, Captain Paxton would have been happy to ride out the storm in a protected bay like this, sail into Presqu'ile a couple of days later after the storm passed. Then's when the nor'easter hit and blew the Speedy back out into Lake Ontario. The dramatic climax of the story is when the Speedy collided with a rock just below the surface of the water on that shallowest point of Dobbs Bank. This was a violent collision. The hull cracked like an egg. The decking broke apart in seconds. The mast toppled over, and along with the people and the passengers and the cargo, everything ended up in the raging lake waters. The 20 souls on board would have died in the collision or within a few minutes as the ship disintegrated around them. Then, with the prevailing winds from the northeast to the southwest, from that point of collision, all the pieces of the ship would have been blown towards the southeast and eventually sank down in the water and found a resting place on the ground over Dobbs Bank. This is the story that Ed believes, what he believes happened to the Speedy, and he would believe that till the day he died in 2017. Some of the information in here could be called speculation. Ed was an engineer, and he knew what he had seen on the ground under the water there on Dobbs Bank during his survey work. So he believed he needed to produce a dramatic and compelling story that would explain how every piece of the ship ended up in that place, in that condition that he saw during his survey work in the 1990s. We could call it reverse engineering. Well, in 2012, Ed Burt refreshed the HMS Speedy Foundation with some new faces. I joined at that time, along with some other folks in the area. As a historian from Brighton, I was interested in learning more about the Speedy story and talking to Ed Burt to find out where this project was at that time. We had many meetings and discussed a number of promotional projects. We did speaking engagements. Sometimes we went individually, sometimes we went together, such as this event at Brighton Probus Club in March of 2014. One of the most enjoyable projects undertaken by the HMS Speedy Foundation at that time was this storyboard that was installed at the Interpretive Center at Presqu'ile Park. I provided the material, the content. Phil Spencer, a member of the group, built the frame. We shared the installation. We got lots of support from the Friends of Presqu'ile Park who operate the Interpretive Center. Of course, this goes along with that dramatic video that's in the theater. The Interpretive Center has been there for a number of years. And of course, the historical plaque that's out there at the shoreline. So the Speedy story is well represented there at Presqu'ile Provincial Park. In spite of all this, the mystery remains. Are those items that Ed Burt saw on the ground under the water over Dobbs Bank actually remains of HMS Speedy? The right answer today is that we don't know. However, the work that Ed Burt did provides some evidence that it might be possible. Of course, Ed would always say that he was 99.99% sure he'd found the remains of the Speedy, and we believe that till the day he died. Bottom line, these artifacts require the attention of professional marine archaeologists. The professional archaeologists must jump in the water over Dobbs Bank and go down there and see these items in situ for themselves. Take the latest wonderful photographic equipment, take lots of pictures. Without the direct engagement of the professionals, the mystery of the Speedy will remain. Question: does it matter? Really, I mean, does it matter? As a historian, I can tell you plainly that it doesn't really matter a lot to me. You know, it would be wonderful to eliminate the mystery, you know, add another little piece of the mosaic, grand mosaic of Canadian history. You know, I'd be one of the happiest people around if that could happen. However, the fact remains that the story of HMS Speedy is a rich and fascinating part of Canadian history. Even without pieces of wood or metal in a museum, it is part of our heritage. And that is good enough for me. In the meantime, we'll continue to tell the story and learn what we can from it. Well, that's the story of HMS Speedy. I hope you enjoy the new book, The Wreck of HMS Speedy, The Tragedy That Shook Up Our Canada. Yes, release date is August 18th. And here's the place where I get a big Cheshire cat grin and say, Indigo loves this book. So it will be distributed across the country. Hopefully that will bode well for it. At the same time, I like to support our local bookstores because they're struggling like everyone else today. If you want more information, please look at my website, Dan Buchanan History Guy. I'm doing other virtual speaking events. And just to point, I will have a page on my website after the book releases called Extra Info, which will include documents for titles that, well, let's say didn't make it into the book or edited out. But I thought history geeks might be interested in seeing them. In any case, folks, that's the story of HMS Speedy, and be glad to answer any questions. Thank you.